Hey, welcome back to Diode Press. I'm Graham. So in the last video, we finished carving our block and we're about ready to start printing. But the last thing we need to do is talk about papers and pick the one we're going to use for this print. So there's literally thousands of different papers you can use to make a print on. So I'm just going to go through a couple options that I have on hand and kind of show you the difference between the different types of paper. And then we'll also go through tearing down our paper and getting ready to start our print. So I'll just go through a little sample I have here. And a special thanks to Eric over at Diode Press. He sent these over to me a while ago, just so I could see kind of different papers that he uses. And so let's look through these. So this is a Crane's letter paper, and it's kind of a thicker, more stiff paper, and it has kind of a nice texture on it. And this is Zirkle book weight paper, and it's a bit of a thinner paper. And this one, I printed this image on it for my last printmaking project. And it picked up ink really well, and I printed both by hand and with a press, and it worked really well for that. It's a really smooth paper. So definitely these are good for like relief printmaking or even like letterpress printmaking. And so there's really a ton of papers like this. You know, there's like Reeves BFK is kind of a standby I use a lot, or Arches 88 is another nice paper a lot of people use for screen printing. It has a really nice smooth surface on the front. So this is USO Minnow. I'm not sure exactly the brand of this, but this is almost like a translucent paper. You can see your hand right through it. And this is good if you're printing like really fine detail from like an engraving or any relief print. It's just a very thin paper, and it's kind of fragile. You have to be careful with printing with things like this. And this is Kitakata, which is a little bit of a thicker paper, and you can see the fibers run through the paper. And depending on your image, if you want to have a gray tone for the background or a white, or there's kind of warm cream tones. So it's really something important to think about when you're picking your paper, when you're making your image, versus just printing on just regular white paper. And to kind of illustrate that point, if you want to see the difference between the same print on two different papers. So this is Reeves BFK printmaking paper, and it's a pretty heavyweight paper, and you can see the image looks nice on it. And then the same image, you can see how translucent this is, and it really gives the image a whole different feel. You can see kind of right through it, and it lays really nice. And so with the same, this was a lithograph, but the same image on two different papers gives a drastic, difference. And if I was to print the same image on this type of paper, it'd give a whole different look as well. So the point being, it's just really important to do some research on different papers and find one you really like. And you can also, print the same image on different papers and see which one you like best. You don't have to stick with your first choice. And so that's kind of a sample of just a few of the papers you can use. I mean, there's literally thousands of papers. So do some research and find ones that you really like. For this project, I'm going to be using this paper here, which is Reeves lightweight paper. And it comes in sheets 19 by 26. And unfortunately they put a sticker on here. Well, this one's not too bad, but sometimes the sticker that they put on will peel up the paper. So it's kind of annoying when they do that, but this one wasn't too bad. A lot of times companies will just write the product number in pencil, the store, so that way you don't have to risk messing up the paper. So this lightweight white, it says it's white, but it's actually more of like a cream tone. You might be able to tell if I hold it up against the Zirkle book weight, which is a pretty bright white. You can see the difference. But I think with our planter that we're doing, it'll look nice, a little bit of a warm tone in the background. So we'll have green and then the black image on there. And so when you get your paper, there's obviously, depending on the type of paper, how they make it, there's going to be usually two distinct sides to it, kind of a front and the back. Sometimes you can't even tell the difference between the texture, and if you print it, you can't even really tell which is front and back. It might look the same, but I found with thicker papers, it's definitely, you can notice it when I do, mezzotints or etchings, where you have a really thick paper, I can definitely tell the difference pretty easily. But on this paper, there's a watermark. It might be a little hard to see, but it says Reeves and it has their small logo. There you go. So you can see the small impression here where they put the brand of the paper. And so when you're reading the paper, or when you're looking at the paper, when you can read this properly, correctly reading, that's the front of the paper. And then, this is the back. And usually they put the label when that stores on the back of the paper, but you can't really depend on that, because sometimes it gets stuck on the front too. It's pretty easy to tell once you see the watermark in here, this is the front of the paper. But once you start cutting or tearing down your paper, it can be hard to figure it out afterwards, especially on a paper like this where there's not a whole lot of difference between the two sides. So often when I tear down my paper, I'll put a small B, for back, on the back of each square. That way when I go to print, it's not a question. I can just automatically know which side to print on. And so in the earlier video, we talked about, the size we were going to use for our paper. And so now it's time to go ahead and tear the paper down to size and tear down enough sheets so we can do our full edition of the print. So there's a couple things you'll need to do this. So definitely optionally, I like to use one of these, self-healing cutting mats when I pretty much do anything on my desk, but it's really nice for cutting paper, tearing down paper, because it has a nice grid system on it. So it makes it easy to make sure you're square and you're tearing it down properly. Speaking of tearing down the paper, so traditionally when paper's made, in the process that they make it with, it ends up with this edge called a deckled edge. And it's just kind of that bumpy edge. And so traditionally when you make your paper ready to print, you tear the paper so you get a matching kind of deckled edge. Sometimes I'll leave a paper, I'll cut it with an X-Acto blade, and that way I can register really easy, get a nice sharp corners, leaving enough extra paper, and then later on I'll go back and I'll tear off that excess paper so I have a nice deckled edge. Sometimes I leave it just square, with a hard cut edge. It's really, personal preference, but traditionally you'll see a deckled edge on the print. And, depending on how you want it to look, the natural deckled edge of this paper looks really nice, but sometimes when you get a sheet of paper, it's not actually square. So you might end up having to tear off, that natural edge that came with the paper and make your own new straight edge. So you'll just have to kind of play around and see. The other thing you need to tear down a paper is some sort of straight edge. So I'm just using a regular center finding ruler, which, it works okay, but ideally you do want to use a paper tear bar, and if you want to invest in one of those, it's something I have on my wish list for sure, but it's basically a ruler with a nice beveled edge that comes to a point on one side. So when you tear your paper against it, it makes a really nice clean edge. Using a ruler like this, it doesn't create quite as nice of an edge when you tear it, but it works fine for what I'm doing. So when I tear paper, I tear it from the back. And I'm left-handed, so this might look a little strange. If you're right-handed, you might be on this side. And so once you line up your ruler where you want it, you just press very firmly. And you want to tear towards you and on top of the ruler, or your tear bar. Because if you just tear straight down, it might not give you a nice clean edge. It might kind of tear out as you're going. So you want to grab it and just, in a motion like this, just tear towards you. And if you have to stop because it's a bigger sheet, that's okay. You just want to get back to the same angle and start tearing it. And you can see a little mark where I stopped for a second, but it's not really that obvious. And I'm doing this from the back of the paper. So, this is the back. And so when you tear it, when you look at the front now, you get a really nice, clean, deckled edge. Whereas on this back side, there's a little bit of you can see the inside of the paper, and it's not quite as clean. But that's the back, so it's okay. But on the front, you get this really nice, clean edge. And I'll show you what that looks like if you do tear. If I tear from the front here, let's tear a little bit. So you can see here on the front, has like a ridge of where the ruler was against. And it just doesn't look very good when you have your print. I mean, it's fine. You can kind of push that down before you print it, and it looks fine. But you'll get a much cleaner edge. See, when you tear it, so that's the back of the paper, and looking at the front, you get a really nice clean edge. And when you tear, you want to make sure you have enough paper to hold on to when you're tearing. So if you're going to leave excess paper on your print, you want to leave, you'd want to leave probably at least 2 inches. And traditionally you want to have a couple inches on all sides of your image of paper overlapping. And since normally you would have your image, and then you have the edition number, the title, and your signature, you might want a little bit of extra room on the bottom side of the print. So the print might not be perfectly centered. You might be a 1/4 inch or so up in the paper. And so if you're tearing down your paper, if you're final size right away, it's not that big of a deal. You can, line up on your exact size you want and tear. But if you're going to do an X-Acto cut edge now, and then come back later and tear, make sure you leave enough of a border. And again, you just line up your paper, and then pull at an angle across the tear bar. you get a nice clean edge. If you were just to pull, straight away, see, it doesn't give you nearly as nice of an edge. It's not straight, and it doesn't really look that good. So I'm going to go ahead and tear down this paper for our print size. So depending on your image, there's this watermark in the paper, and you might not want that in your final print. If your image is smaller, this might distract visually. Some watermarks in paper is, really small and subtle. This one's actually a little bit more intense. But since whenever I print, there's always some that don't work out, or, the first one might not turn out good, I usually end up using this corner first, just so that's kind of my test print, make sure everything's good before I really move on to printing a lot. So I'm not too worried about it. Now I can just line up on my 2 pencil marks, hold the ruler secure, tear the paper. And see, so now I need to move further down. But there's kind of a nice raised edge when you tore the paper along here. So the ruler kind of just slides down. You just want to make sure you're still lined up with your marks. Hold it firmly. Finish the tear. So depending on how big your final edition is going to be, you'll have to tear more or less paper. I usually plan on, my editions are fairly small. I'll probably only do maybe 10 of this print. And then I have a couple sheets extra in case I mess up a couple. That always happens. And I might also do, some different paper I have and see what that looks like. So we'll just kind of play it by ear as we go. But I think this is a good enough start to start printing. All right, so we have all our paper torn down and ready to go. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and ink up the block and print our image. I'll see you then. Thanks. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the videos when they're posted, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to help support this channel, you can check out the Diode Press Patreon page, where I post behind the scenes photos as well as other patron rewards. Thanks!